Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Critical theory has become firmly entrenched amongst modern political and social thinkers. The greatest challenge we have as Christians in confronting this philosophy is the social sins of the past and critical theory's seductive promise to eradicate all injustice by destroying hierarchies and social structures of dependency. We're joined by Michel Therrien to talk about this. Michael is no stranger to this program, president of the Preambula group, host of the Wise Guys podcast, author of The Catholic Faith Explained, and other works. You can read you can read Michael's other essays in the description of today's program. Michael, thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Marcus.
I'm really pleased with these two pieces that were out in what we need now, the Substack, and I'm very glad that that you're attempting to engage this issue. So, I'd like to begin by asking you to talk about what critical theory is, why it's all around us right now, even if people don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's a big question, but I think the simplest way to answer that for people is just that whenever we hear about socialism or Marxism or communism or some of the elements of like radical feminism or radical ecology, these social ideologies, they all really are part of the same sort of philosophical framework that originates in the 19th century. With thinkers like Feuerbach and Marx and others that really have shaped what we might today call our sort of postmodern society and culture. So that's critical theory is sort of, I would describe it as like the underlying philosophical framework of all of those different ideologies that really shape our lives today in our culture and society.
What does critical theory purport? What is its primary driving creed, if you will?
Well, I think I would say first that there is a desire to eradicate the problem of social injustice in the world by enacting a kind of revolutionary process to create what I like to call an egalitarian society, where in fact what we do is try to eliminate all the distinctions and differences that exist among us to create a sort of social collective. And another way that people sometimes talk about this is, talking about sort of an outcome-based approach to social life versus a merit-based. So, socialism, for example, tries to abolish private property, in favor of creating kind of this radical egalitarianism among, all workers within the economic order. In radical feminism, for example, it's an attempt to really abolish the actual and real distinctions between men and women, and so on. So I always like to think of it as this kind of project of a forced egalitarianism that's brought about through a kind of revolutionary process, where you kind of deconstruct and tear down existing social structures in order to try to create this sort of equality of outcomes across society.
Can you briefly touch on the very clear Marxist roots of critical theory and how it evolved from that kind of class struggle into equality of outcome as the primary drive?
Yeah, so, Marx was, you could say, a keen observer of some of the fallout of the rise of the liberal capitalist system, and perceived that there was a certain alienation, you would call it, that was taking place for the working class people. He described this alienation as like the laborer was alienated from the fruits of his labor because the owners of capital, right, retain a certain exclusive right to the means of production and therefore the profitability of a business. And so he wanted to enact an economic system that would, in effect, abolish private property and, basically hand the ownership of the means of production entirely over to the government. And then there would be, in his vision of things, a equal and just distribution of all the goods of the economic order and system. And so, he went about trying to start a kind of social revolution to overthrow the capitalist system. But the historical truth and reality of that is that Marxism never really succeeded in any market-based economic country. It really got its first success, and it succeeded mostly in societies that were primarily agrarian or agricultural, sort of holdovers from the old feudal system. So think of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, for example. So that was his project, but I think without going on just too much longer here, just to say that the idea of deconstructing one social system and then enacting this kind of egalitarian system kind of hopped from the economic order into other areas of social life, so into the family, into politics. And now we see things like, gender, the whole transgender movement. It's rooted in the same fundamental basic principles.
Like you rightly highlight, Marxism's successes are few, and even then when we talk about its quote-unquote successes, they tend to be the result of tremendous bloodshed and the massive curtailing of human flourishing. Now, I set that up because I want to ask you, has critical theory ever resulted in a flourishing society despite its purported claims?
No, I mean, it just really hasn't. It hasn't ever succeeded anywhere. And, the church has tremendous insight as to why that is. And that's because the system itself is so contrary to human nature, and it abuses the function of the state, and it also subsumes the individual and the dignity of the individual person into a kind of collective, which really instrumentalizes everybody in the system. And what ends up happening is the only way to affect the outcome that they desire is essentially to eliminate everybody that opposes it. So that's why we ended up with things like the Gulag out, under Soviet, Russia. We saw the Holocaust under National Socialism in Germany. There's differences in those systems, but they share very similar roots philosophically. So you can think of what's happened in China, and you think of what's happened in Cuba, what's going on in North Korea today. So it's a very consistent outcome that always leads to a lot of bloodshed, and usually the elimination of the weakest and most vulnerable.
Which, if I may quote Orwell here, tends to be the case that wherever Marxist ideology has been instituted, all become equal. Some are just more equal than others.
Right.
So we're going to pause there because the music is about to hit. I'm having a conversation with Michel Therrien about critical theory and the politics of divine love. Michel is a president of the Preambula group, host of the Wise Guys podcast, and author of 2 pieces in the What We Need Now Substack. And we are continuing on the other side of the break because critical theory is in the air we breathe in the West right now, and it's worrisome. We need to know what it is and identify it so that we can not only speak against it, but uproot this evil from our society. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Mark Speeder talking with Michel Therrien. Michel wears many hats, president of the Preambula group, host of the Wise Guys podcast, prolific author, and he's recently written 2 pieces for the What We Need Now Substack on critical theory and the politics of divine love. So let's continue where we left off, Michel. That the proponents of critical theory, they couch their, not just their philosophy, but its application thereof in a false sense of compassion. And the language, the appeal seems almost Christian until you scratch the surface. Can you please speak to that?
Yeah, I think that the way I would describe that is that critical theory is good at paying attention to where there is injustice, like where people that are in places of social dependency are not being given their due in the order of justice. The problem is that the solutions that they propose to try to eradicate that justice do such violence to the natural law and the natural moral order that God has established that the irony of it is they end up becoming the very evil they're trying to destroy in the process. So in order to eradicate these injustices, a certain select group of elites appoint themselves the right to sort of level the playing field for everyone else, regardless of how much violence that requires. And for those who stand in opposition to giving the state that kind of power, they end up just becoming the victims of a tyrannical autocratic regime. And so this has just played itself out in place after place after place where it's been tried. And so I always call it sort of a parody of the kingdom of God, because while it seems to aspire to a social vision that sounds very gospel-like, the only way you can attain that end is by very evil means of getting there.
Knowing all of this, and just even a cursory overview of the history of Marxism and the history of critical theory, we know that it never yields good fruit for a society. Why is there still a continued enamoring and intoxication with the ideology?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that, I believe. I think it tends to appeal. I mean, I'm talking about our immediate context here in the United States for the moment. But, when you're a young university student and you're first awakening to the very real problems that our world has, it can be a very seductive ideology because the vision for the future is so intoxicating. It sounds so great and wonderful. And I also think it tends to appeal to people that have experienced a lot of perhaps rejection and social marginalization themselves. And so it's very attractive and it's very appealing. The problem is, and I think it's not always the case, but I think as people live more life and grow older, many of us realize, this doesn't actually work in the real world. It can't work for any number of reasons because it's not the way the world actually works in real life. So I think it's largely driven by an education system that's very bent and biased on positioning itself as a political organization that's trying to, in a sense, advocate for a kind of Marxist worldview, which I think has also betrayed really the purpose of a university itself, which is to be open to a much more honest exploration of the world of truth and ideas, and so there's a kind of indoctrination, I think, that takes place in universities across the world right now that is very biased towards this view of things. And oftentimes that gets into the imagination and the minds of young people who then, as they come up through the ranks, try to impose these systems, when it's their turn. And then, we find out that it turns out in the same terrible way that it always does. And I think there's this tendency to think, well, it just wasn't tried correctly the last time. We just need to do it right this time. And I make the point in the article that the problem is that it's always tried the right way. It just will never succeed because it does such violence to human nature and the dignity of the human person.
The other thing that you've highlighted too is critical theory and Marxism promises a egalitarian of sorts, but more a complete, equal society, zero structure, zero hierarchies, all are completely the same. But even under its best circumstances, nature, natural law simply abhors complete equality. Can you please speak to that?
Yeah, so we have to be really careful because when talking about this, because obviously every human being is equal in dignity, because we share the same nature and ontology. Like, we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And so we're all equal in our dignity in that respect. But God has also created us distinct from one another in terms of everything from talents to social position to positions of authority, intelligence, and so on. And the church believes that those distinctions are ordered to a sort of unity and distinction that images the Trinity. And so we're not to abolish those distinctions, but we're to work through our social relationships to a place of interdependency, where, I become reliant on you because of the gifts or the social position you have, and you become dependent on me because of what I bring to the table. But what happens is we create a very rigid socially stacked structure where those at the top have all the privileges and all the advantages, and those at the bottom, don't. And that's the consequence of sin. Sin has brought that about. So I think the critical theorist wants to say, well, let's abolish all of the distinctions. And the Christian should say, no, let's heal the woundedness of our social relationships through a true understanding of justice and charity, so that we uphold the unity that we are to have, but we also respect and honor the distinctions that exist and the social dependencies that exist among us. So, like, one example I always turn to is the relationship between parents and children. Right? There's a clear social dependency, that a child has on their parents in order to achieve mature adulthood. Well, we see societies abolishing that dependency and creating a kind of egalitarian relationship between a child and their parents, such that a child can go have a transitional, gender transitional surgery without even informing their parents. And that does tremendous violence to the fundamental structures, the natural structures of the family, which is for the good of the children, and the spouses, but, the children who are the most vulnerable in that relationship. So that's, if that makes sense, like, to contrast the way a Christian is supposed to look at this versus the way a critical theorist would.
And within that Christian worldview, the hierarchies exist so that the higher can serve the younger, like you've rightly mentioned. You touch on the principle of subsidiarity. Help us understand how that plays out in the Catholic faith.
Yeah, so, we can think of social relationships in terms of a kind of master-slave relationship. And in the master-slave relationship, those who are sort of lower, in a place of greater social dependency, sort of exist for the sake of those in the higher position. And so you instrumentalize the people down the social hierarchy for the advantage of the people who are at the top. And that's an unjust system. What Jesus reveals and what Scripture reveals in general is that, those in the greater position are meant to serve those in the lower position and really stand under them. That's what subsidiarity means. And to lift them up to the full realization of their potential and their perfection, their end, their, as a human being, as a person. And so you think of a parent, like, a parent's job is not to turn their children into indentured servants. The purpose of parents is to actually create the conditions for their children to thrive and actualize their potential and become fully contributing adult members of society someday. So, you can parent in either way, but if you're going to treat your children as slaves, you're going to end up abusing them. But if you treat your children with solidarity and love and in a subsidiary fashion, you're always going to be, in a sense, creating the conditions for your child to flourish. And that's true of whether you're the coach of a sports team, whether you're the mayor of a town, whether you're the CEO of a corporation. The leader is, as Jesus tells us, supposed to serve and not exist to be served. Or, Paul tells us of Jesus himself that he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, in order, in a sense, to lift us up and raise us up to the divine life. So that's the model that we're given. So never the master slave. The hierarchy is supposed to be a hierarchy of service and love.
We could go on a lot, Michael, but we're out of time. Thank you so very much for speaking to us about this. How can people follow your work?
Yeah, well, you can check me out at preambula.org. That's where my organization's website is, and there you will find the Wise Guys podcast. We're also found on all the streaming channels as well, and that's the best place to find me.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Great pleasure speaking with you.
Yes, thank you, Marcus.
My guest has been Michel Therrien, president of the Preambula Group, host of the Wise Guys podcast, prolific author. We've been talking about 2 new pieces he put out on critical theory. Please check out the articles, really. It's on the What We Need Now Substack, linked in today's program. Please find out more about critical theory, why it's so evil, and why we need to stand against it. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.